I'm introducing these anatomy videos aiming at simplifying the basic anatomy with some correlation of the clinical anatomy by using mostly cadaveric specimens, which are more reliable to understand the basic anatomy. Kindly subscribe for these videos to reach more audience, and also share and like the videos to promote them and to get them on the main screen of the YouTube. Thank you. Now to the coming session. In that session, we are going to describe the orbit as part 1. We'll start by the bony orbit. Here is the bony orbit, where we can see the skull here with the orbital cavity, which is a cone like having in front a circle and the apex is posterior. Demonstrating the walls, we have a roof, a floor, a lateral wall, and medial wall. We'll start by the roof, where it's formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone and the lesser wing of the sphenoid, while the medial wall is formed by the frontal bone and the lacrimal bone and the orbital plate of sphenoid. And this is a very thin wall on the medial side of the orbit. Lastly, the body of the sphenoid forms part of the medial wall. The lateral wall is formed by the zygomatic bone, the frontal bone, and the greater wing of the sphenoid, while the floor is formed by the zygomatic bone again and the maxilla. That is about the floor, with the palatine bone a bit posterior. That is the palatine bone here. Now let us go to what's called the lacrimal apparatus. Before that, let's have a look for the surface features of the eye. We can see the iris, which is behind the cornea. That is the iris over here. Then the pupil in the middle of the iris. Then this is the upper eyelid. That is the lower eyelid. That is the plica semilunaris here. That's the sclera, the white one. That is the lacrimal crankle. That is the lacrimal papilla over here. And that is the limbus, which is the corneoscleral junction. That is the surface marking. These are the parts forming what we call it the lacrimal apparatus, formed of the gland. From the gland, many ducts, lacrimal ducts, will pour the tear into the superior and inferior conjunctival fornices, which will reach to the punctum and then collect from the punctum by many lacrimal canaliculi, which will get the tears into what we call it the lacrimal sac. The lacrimal sac will end up by a duct, which will end into the nose. That is a cadaveric specimen showing parts of this lacrimal apparatus, where we can see the lacrimal gland on the lateral side and the sac in the upper part here of the medial side. And then you can see the lacrimal canaliculi down in the lower part, and also the lacrimal papillae and punctum and the lower part. Then we can see the opening of the lacrimal sac through the nasolacrimal duct, which will reach the inferior meatus of the nose. Then we can see the supraorbital nerve and vessels, and the infraorbital nerve and vessels inferiorly. That's again still the same specimen, where we can see the aponeurosis of the levator palpebrae superioris, the muscle fibers of the levator itself, then the cut edge of the orbital septum here, and the periosteum, both of them. We can see the inferior oblique at the inferior part of the orbital cavity. The tendon of the superior oblique can be seen above here. Also, the trochlea can be seen. The medial palpebral ligament can be seen, and the orbital bed of fat in the lower part here. That is about this apparatus. Now, let's go to the orbital fascia, where we have three types of fascia. The periosteum, which is not very much fixed to the bone. The periosteum, then the bulbar sheaths, which surround the eye globe, and the muscular sheaths which surround each muscle. These are the three types of fascia: periosteum, bulbar sheath, and muscular sheath. Here, the facial sheath of the eyeball, or the bulbar sheath, which you have seen it before, that one covers the eyeball extending from the optic nerve to the sclerocorneal junction, separating it from the orbital bed of fat, which will be filling that place here. Then that is the medial cheek ligament, and that is the lateral cheek ligament. Each is thickening of the facial sheath around the medial rectus on the medial side and the lateral rectus on the lateral side. Then they are attached to the lacrimal and the zygomatic bone. On the medial side, the lacrimal, on the lateral side, the zygomatic bones. Here is another figure showing the fascia where the medial palpebral ligament can be seen, the suspensory ligament, the tarsal plates above and down here, the transverse ligament, the lateral palpebral ligament, and again in another specimen here we can see the levator palpebrae superioris here. We can see the lacrimal gland on the lateral side, and you can see the superior tarsal plate, one of the fascia here, and the inferior tarsal plate. That is the fascia within the orbit in summary. That is the inferior oblique muscle, which we have seen it before, coming from the floor of the orbit to reach the globe. Now let's go to the orbit, looking to the orbit from above after we remove the roof of each of these orbit. So what we can see here is the eyeball. We can see the lacrimal gland on the lateral side here and here. We can see the lacrimal artery, which will supply the gland. Then the medial rectus can be seen. The ophthalmic artery, which is the very large artery over here. The cribriform plate of osmoid. The lacrimal nerve reaching the gland. The frontal nerve, which is the most superficial one when you are looking from above. The anterior osmoidal nerve and artery, which go in the anterior and posterior osmoidal. That is the anterior osmoidal here, and that is the cresta galli. Still looking from above for the orbit, we can see the optic nerve with the short ciliary nerves overlying it, the nasociliary nerve crossing the optic nerve, the trochlear nerve going to the superior oblique to supply, the levator palpebrae superioris, the cut edge over here, and directly under the frontal nerve over here. Then the superior oblique, which will curve around the trochlea, and then that is the tendon. Then the superior rectus, a cut edge over here, and cut edge over here. And lastly, that is the lateral rectus. That's all what we can see. Now for the extraocular muscles. Here is the arrangement of the muscles within the orbit in that very simple diagram, showing the four recti in the different directions. The lacrimal gland will indicate the lateral side. The superior oblique will indicate the medial side. The inferior oblique will be below the inferior rectus, and the levator palpebrae superioris above. So what we can see here, we can see the lacrimal gland on the lateral side, the superior oblique, the superior rectus, the levator palpebrae above, the medial rectus, the inferior oblique below the lateral rectus, below the inferior rectus, and the lateral rectus on the lateral side. That's how they are distributed within the orbital cavity. That is a cadaveric specimen showing those extraocular muscles where you can see the levator palpebrae superioris here. You can see the superior rectus. You can see the inferior rectus. That is the medial rectus here. Then the lateral rectus over here. Then the superior oblique muscle in the upper medial corner, and that is the tendon of the superior oblique. Then that is the trocula here, and that is the tendon. Then the inferior oblique, which comes from the floor of the orbit to the globe. These are the 7 extraocular muscles as they are distributed within the cavity of the orbit. That is the lacrimal gland, indicating the lateral side. Here, another specimen showing the same muscles, but in a better way. That is the levator palpebrae superioris here, the whole muscle. That is the tendon of the superior oblique. That is the superior oblique self. That is the superior rectus. And that is the medial rectus. That is the lateral rectus reflected here and here. So these are the muscles. Now let's start by the 4 recti muscles. Here the same which we have seen before, but indicating the 4. They are attached posteriorly to a tendinous ring, a common ring, which give origin to the 4 recti. The ring encircles the superior medial and inferior margins of the optic canal, and then continue laterally across the inferior and medial parts of the superior orbital fissure, attached to the tubercle, which we call it the lingula, on the margin of the greater wing of the sphenoid. That is the common origin of the 4 recti. While the superior rectus, and that is the inferior rectus, that is the medial rectus, and that is the lateral rectus, and that is the common tendinous ring, which you have seen it before. The nerve supply, all these muscles are supplied by the oculomotor, except the lateral rectus by the abducent nerve. That's again the tendinous ring. Now, that is the eyeball here. That is the superior rectus reflected. That is the inferior rectus. That is the nerve to the inferior rectus. That is the medial rectus, and that's its nerve, the nerve to the medial rectus. That is the lateral rectus with its nerve reflected. So these are the 4 muscles with their nerve supply. Now there is 2 oblique muscles, as we know. There is, start with the superior oblique, we can see it here on the medial side, then the trocula, then the tendon. The origin is from the body of the sphenoid, superior medial to the optic canal, then pass forwards to end in a round tendon, which we can see it here, which plays through a fibrocartilaginous loop around the trocula. It's attached to the trochlear fossa, that trocula attached to the trochlear fossa of the frontal bone. The insertion, the tendon descends posterolaterally and inferiorly to the superior rectus, inferior to that muscle, and is attached to the sclera in the superior lateral part of the posterior quadrant behind the equator. The 2 obliques are behind the equator, while the 4 recti are in front of the equator, and that muscle end between the superior and the lateral recti. The nerve supply is the trochlear nerve. The superior oblique, again here we can see it here, that is the superior oblique, that is the trocula, that is the superior oblique tendon. That is the trochlear nerve which supplies that muscle. And here is the lacrimal gland. Now, still the inferior oblique, we're going to the inferior oblique now, where it is found at the floor of the orbit. That is the two bars here, that is the muscle. The origin is from, it lies near the margin of the floor, as we said, and it takes origin from the orbital surface of the maxilla lateral to the nasolacrimal fossa. And then it ascends posterolaterally, at first between the inferior rectus and the orbital floor, and then between the eyeball itself and the lateral rectus, to be inserted into the lateral part of the sclera behind the equator like the superior, in the inferior lateral part of the posterior quadrant between the inferior and lateral recti. Its nerve supply, which you have seen it, is the oculomotor, from the oculomotor nerve. Now, that's again another specimen for the inferior oblique. That is the globe here, and that is the inferior oblique muscle here, and that is the nerve to the inferior oblique coming from the oculomotor nerve. Now, the levator palpebrae superioris. So that is the levator palpebrae superioris here, the whole muscle, as you can see. That is the muscle, and that is the tendon. It takes origin from the inferior aspect of the lesser winged sphenoid, just above and front of the optic canal, to be inserted into three parts. Part which go to the anterior surface of the tarsus, and part which will pierce the orbicularis oculi muscle to the skin of the upper eyelid, and a part which go to the superior conjunctival fornix, so it can elevate the upper eyelid as one part. The nerve supply is two innervations, one which is somatic by a branch of the superior division of the oculomotor from the inferior surface, and a smooth part where supplied by sympathetic fibers which will come from the plexus around the internal carotid artery. The action is elevation of the upper eyelid. That is another good specimen for the levator palpebrae superioris, the whole muscle over here. We can see the frontal nerve. We can see the supratrochlear and the supraorbital nerves, and that is what we can see in that slide here. Now, about the action of these muscles, let's have the orbital axis first. We have the axis of the orbit itself, which is upwards and laterally on both sides. Then anteroposterior axis of the orbit, which is almost parallel to the middle line. There is an angle here which is 23 between these two, which are the axis of the orbit and the anteroposterior one, and there is another angle between the two lateral walls of the orbit. As you can see, the orbit is directed forwards and laterally to increase the field of vision. The lateral orbital walls are here, and these are the medial orbital walls. Now here is the apex of the orbit, and the equator is the one dividing the orbit into two parts, anterior and posterior, as we have noticed in the insertion of the muscles. And then we can see here the superior oblique. We can see again the trochlea, and the inferior oblique can be seen over here. Now, the orbital axis, that is what we call it the equator, where the four recti muscles are inserted in front of the equator. These are the four recti. And the two obliques behind the equator, the inferior and the superior obliques. As for the action of the muscles, of the extraocular muscles, There are adductors, which are the medial rectus, the superior rectus, and the inferior rectus. The abductors are the lateral rectus, the inferior oblique, and the superior oblique, while the elevators are two muscles, superior rectus and inferior oblique, while the depressors are also two, the inferior rectus and the superior oblique. About the rotators, the lateral rotator are two muscles, inferior rectus and inferior oblique, while the medial are the superior rectus and the superior oblique. And that's all about the ocular muscles, the extraocular muscles. Thank you for listening, and your comments are much appreciated and will be useful. If you have any comments, just write it down. And if you have any questions about the topic or the subject, or something is not clear for you, you can just put it on the wall of this YouTube and will be most welcomed. I will answer it immediately. Thank you again.